reason it's relevant is because if you're doing any sort of community safety survey for the purpose of these particular grant programs, or generally understanding crime and safety in a particular location, is you need to be specific. So this is drawn actually from our evaluation toolkit in terms of measuring community safety for the purpose of evaluation. But essentially what we're saying is if you're going to ask these questions in community safety, make sure it's specific to the target area. Don't ask people general questions about how safe they feel, because that will tell you nothing about the level of safety in that location. And you'll probably find that people say they feel more unsafe than they actually do in public spaces in your local council. So you want to really target your questions appropriately so that you can unpack how people feel in the location that you're interested in. So that's the takeaway point that I really want to leave you with in terms of fear. I really want to just briefly talk about safety audits, and then I'm not going to hold you up from morning tea. So safety audits, there's probably people in the room who are a lot more proficient at safety audits than I am. I've had limited experience in actually undertaking safety audits, but I know there's something that a lot of people in council will have had experience doing. If you haven't, a safety audit is essentially the idea of one or more stakeholders coming together and going out to the public a public space with a checklist of things to look for in terms of the built and natural environment that might be creating either opportunities for crime or making people feel unsafe. And it's kind of a systematic way of assessing a community space to identify opportunities for intervention. Again, there's some fantastic guidelines that will give you far better overview of safety audits than I ever will. Some of them are a little bit dated, but they're still incredibly useful. I'll talk about the Victorian guidelines later. They don't appear here, but they are later on when I start talking about the SEPTED response. But the Queensland Guide is really useful, the Crime Prevention through Environmental Design Guidelines for Queensland, because it actually has a really nice safety audit checklist that you can use if you're going out and doing this sort of thing in your community. There's another guide from the POP Centre, which is also really useful, a little bit American. There's no Americans in the room, but there's a little bit American in the way they sort of talk about problems and design, but it's another really useful resource in terms of problem solving and thinking about SEPTED and audits. And sort of stepping back a little bit, the European Forum for Urban Safety has produced a guide for local safety audits. Not so specific to places, it takes a more generalised view of safety audits, but it's really useful in terms of understanding and unpacking problems in communities from a variety of perspectives, and also honing on particular groups, vulnerable groups who might be feeling particularly unsafe. So it's another general resource that I'd encourage you to look at if you're interested. Again, I'll make all of the links to these actually available in the online version of the presentation. In terms of what a safety audit is all about though, and this is drawn from that Queensland Guide, is the idea of having essentially this, as I said, checklist or a kind of a way of recording information about particular properties of your space that you're focusing on. So the checklist in the Queensland Guide talks about general impressions of an area. How does it generally feel? And you typically would do this collectively with either other stakeholders or members of the community who can provide you with those sort of general impressions. So it's meant to be a collaborative process. Second one is around lighting. So what is the lighting like in the space? Obviously you want to do this at different times of the day, so you want to see how lighting appears at night time. So you will need to do safety audits during the day and at night, and that's another really important point. And at different times during the week if possible, so looking at weekends versus weekdays, for example. General sight lines, so how's visibility of space within the public area? Are there particular areas where it's very difficult to see? And then are there particular areas where someone might feel particularly isolated? Either they are isolated or they might feel isolated and might feel like if they're walking there, they can't be seen or heard. Looking at the spaces around your public area, how are those spaces used and how might that impact, particularly somewhere like a public park, for example, how might the areas around that public park actually influence how that space might be used. Movement predictability, so there's some evidence around people's patterns of movement which may kind of provide opportunities for crime because it becomes predictable. And that's something else to consider. Signs, public transport stops, the overall design of a particular area. Maintenance is really important. I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And then the last step of this kind of safety audit process is identifying improvements. So demonstrating that you've undertaken a safety audit, particularly if you're looking at a SEPTED style project, you're looking at some sort of design, improving public amenity, the sorts of things Sean talked about. A safety audit is really important in demonstrating the level of thinking that's gone into actually the development of that project. So I just want to end briefly this session just talking about my example. as I said, it was a fantastic example until the ACT government started doing something about it, because now it's now they're taking action. But anyway, so Hague Park, as I said, it's much maligned, and there's been some recent reports both in terms of crime data and also some community engagement around what's going on. And I think it's interesting because I think it's going to be a fairly common phenomenon to some of the public spaces that you'd be looking at. So the police data that was reported recently, this is over a 5-year period, and what you can see is crime is actually really low. For 5 years, in a really large urban space, crime is actually incredibly low. But what's important there is there have been some really critical incidents, and these are the incidents that people remember. There's a really serious homicide there. People remember that. People in Canberra's a small place, but people remember, and that affects how people perceive the space. Some serious sexual assaults and robberies as well. There's some missing data, importantly. So if I was to look at this data, I'd go, oh, what about theft? Where's theft in this data? Why haven't we picked up on theft? There's some car parks there. There's a building there. There's some other things going on. So we need to think. Have we looked at all opportunities for crime? But I think the general message here is that crime is not terribly high. So we've probably got a perceptions problem, and this was unpacked in the recent community engagement survey work that was done by the ACT government, where they identified safety as a concern, but not consistently. There were concerns about the legitimate use of the park, but there are also counter concerns about people saying, stop saying it's unsafe. It's not. It's fine. We use this space all the time. So there's a real contradiction in terms of people's perception of the area. Lots of comments about safety after dark and the need for improved lighting. But, and this is where, without wanting to be critical, there were not specific questions about safety in terms of crime. It was very generalised, and I think the lesson here from this type of engagement is you need to be very specific. You're applying for a public safety infrastructure project grant. You need to ask specific questions about safety, not in a way that makes people fearful, but unpacks the problems in your public area. And the other thing is there's not been any community safety survey done here. So obviously the next logical step, I'm not sure whether this will happen, but the next logical step is to actually go out and survey people that use the space, the residents and the business operators kind of north and south of the space, and actually get a genuine baseline of community safety and perceptions of safety in the public space. There's still a lot of work to do in terms of understanding, but generally speaking, what we're seeing here is a perceptions problem, not necessarily a crime problem. And I'll unpack that a little bit as we go along.